Hey, it's Ryan with an updated fishing report from Big Stone Lake. It is mid-December and we're on the tail end of quite the snowstorm. This week we'll get started with the ice conditions. Prior to the snowstorm, we were on a pretty good track. We were making ice, at a relatively good clip. I spent most of my time in the central portion of the lake. I heard that when you got to the extreme north end, the northern third of the lake, or south of the islands on the very, very southern portion of the lake, that there were some interesting ice conditions, areas where maybe waterfowl were keeping it open, and things were a little bit different in those areas. If you're going there, definitely check things as you go along. I wasn't up there. I didn't look for myself. But that's what I've been hearing, and I would definitely be cautious going forward in those areas, the extreme north end and south of the islands on the extreme south end of the lake. In the central portion of the lake, what I was finding was at the low end, 9.5 inches of ice, and at the upper end, about 12 inches of ice. I went to a half a dozen different spots. I went through some different areas. I kind of checked as I went along, and the ice was pretty consistent. So we were making ice, we were doing well, and we were moving in the right direction. Now, to address the elephant in the room, this snowstorm. We got a fair amount of wet, heavy snow. I don't know exactly what the totals are. I don't know if we got 8-10 inches or what yet. I haven't heard that. But last night I went out when things were starting to taper off a little bit with the snow, and I checked for myself to see, what the differences were on the lake. And the snow had definitely been pushing the ice down, and we were definitely slushing up out on the lake. Now, what I can say to that is generally that's a really bad thing. We don't want that early season. But what I noticed was there wasn't a big, thick, insulating layer of snow on the lake. In fact, what I found was just a thin little layer of snow. And when I started to get out a little bit farther towards the middle of the lake, just at least 100 yards or so offshore, a lot of the slush that was on the lake was exposed to the air. So that's a good thing, and that's really positive considering the forecast that we have coming. In the weather forecasts, I've heard that next week is being described as a polar vortex or some Siberian polar vortex or something along those lines. But it's going to get cold, and I'm seeing lows pushing that -20, somewhere in that range. So we're going to start hardening things up, and I think the slush that's on the lake is not going to doom the lake for the season. I think it's going to be an inconvenience for this weekend, and I think after this cold weather that we're getting this week, by Christmas time or even before Christmas time, I think we're going to be right back on track again, and we're going to be doing just fine out there. Moving on to the fishing. Fishing was pretty good last week. I noticed that areas that typically are very good for me early season were not as great, but I didn't have to get too far away from them to catch fish. And what I mean by that is when I'm fishing Big Stone in the winter, pretty much everything I'm doing is revolving around the basin. But early season, something I like to do is instead of just being randomly out in the basin, I like to find where the basin kind of adjoins up to structure. If I can find where there's rocks or a good gravel transition that pushes right up to the basin in deep water, those are typically my favorite spots early season, December, kind of before the first of the year. And what I noticed was the areas that are typically good to me this time of year, that I do well on those transitions, I wasn't doing well this last week. But I didn't have to move too far away from them. Fish were still using those similar areas. I just pushed a little bit off of the structure, a little bit further out into the basin, and there they were. Some areas I was marking a mix of fish. I was finding crappies, bluegills, and perch. Other areas, it seemed like it was mostly just perch. What I will say is the bite was pretty good. I noticed that as far as crappies went, a lot of them were small, but they were very aggressive. If I had a crappie move in, jig the jig a couple times, bam, they had hit it. The bluegills were a whole nother story. During the day, a lot of bluegills would scream right up to your bait, and as soon as they would get close, they would stop, they'd back away, and take off. And that's not uncommon for this time of year. Those bluegills are big, they're good-sized fish, and some of them are being finicky. But as typical for this time of year with the bluegills, when you got close to the evening, that last portion of the day before it gets dark out, you would start catching a few. So that's typical for bluegills. I expect to see them turn on a little bit better as we get later into the season. On to the perch. Perch bite was pretty good. Some fish were more aggressive than others. There's little fish in there. There's big fish in there. You're going to have to do some sorting, as always, on Big Stone. But if you're looking to go out and get a meal of perch, you definitely can do it right now. And I expect that bite to continue well throughout the season. There's a lot of fish in the lake. As far as techniques, most of what I use is just a simple tungsten jig. You can use them in that 4 to 5 millimeter size. I try to get away with the smaller ones if I can. Some days when the perch bite is really aggressive, but the schools are moving fast, I'll actually go to a little bit larger size tungsten jig just so I can get it back down the hole quicker and get more fish in a hurry. But generally, when I'm picking out a tungsten jig, it's going to be one of 3 colors. It's either going to be gold, glow, or something very bright like fire tiger. Those 3 colors get the job done day in, day out. Gold typically always gets it done anyway. So as long as you have a gold tungsten jig, you're kind of on the right track. As far as baiting it, you know, a guy can either use wax worms or spikes. I always go for the spikes. They're easier to take care of. I put a lot of them on the hook at a time. When I have little fish down there picking away at my jig, the spikes tend to stay on a lot better. I'm just fishing more efficiently with them. Wax worms work well, but the little fish can pluck that wax worm off, and then you're baiting your hook and you're just not as efficient. Those little jigs were working for all 3, the bluegills, the crappies, and the perch. You know, all 3 were taken well to the little tungsten jig, which they always do. There's another technique that you can use, and typically I find this on particular days when the fish are just really aggressive. A lot of times you'll find that the schools of smaller perch will be mixed with the bigger perch. I see this more often mid-season, but for some reason they'll be on an aggressive bite during the day, and you just have trouble getting down to the big perch. And something that I like to do, a little technique that I like to do when I'm having trouble getting the bigger ones out of the school, is to simply just go to a larger size jigging spoon. 1/8 ounce rattle spoon. There's a few options out there, but an 1/8 ounce rattle spoon, bright color, loaded up with bugs, jig it fairly aggressively. A lot of times you'll be able to keep those smaller perch at bay, and you'll get the bigger fish that you're actually looking for. Another technique that works well throughout the season, especially as I get later into the season, not so much early on, but I will be using it more and more, is just a plain hook and a minnow. A dead stick or a set line with just a fathead minnow on a plain hook about 2 to 3 feet off the bottom. A lot of times they'll catch your biggest perch of the day. It's a great way to just keep a second line down there. You just put it on a bobber, or you can sit it on a tip up outside the house. But a bigger fathead minnow will keep the smaller fish off, and a lot of times you find that that's when you catch your really big perch throughout the day. Hopefully this info helps you out, and good luck fishing.